We're going to talk about slavery. It's going to be a little bit more about worldwide slavery, but we're going to address slavery in the United States. There are people who say, well, the United States is founded on slavery. No, it was not founded on slavery. That's just absolute nonsense. The vast majority of slavery that existed in the United States happened after the foundation of the country. There were two major waves of slavery that occurred in the United States between 1800 and 1850. I don't know the exact dates. Maybe it was, let's say, 1820. There was a giant wave of slaves coming to the United States. And maybe in 1840, there was a second giant wave. And it really wasn't that many people. It's not like it was millions and millions and millions of people. It was small numbers of people compared to a modern population. Of all the slaves in the world, the slaves that came to the United States was such a small fraction, not even 1%. The fraction of slaves at that time and through the history of the world was so insignificant, the United States was a minor player in African slavery. Not even 1%. If you look at the Americas alone, slavery in the United States may have been between 1% and 3% of slavery in North and South America. Most slaves went to the Caribbean islands and to Brazil, not the United States, small number. The slave trade was illegal. If they caught your boat, they would sink it. They didn't catch every boat, but they caught a lot of boats. There's actually a record of all the boats that were caught in the slave trade and what they did with them, and whether or not, how they dealt with the slaves. And there's a record of the boats that they didn't catch. They know there's records of this stuff. Slavery, first of all, there's no such thing that people were free in the world before the 1800s. No matter where you lived in the world, you lived under the rule of a king, a queen, an emperor, the church, the tribe, a collective society, etc. People did not own personal property. They were serfs or part of a collective society, or slaves. The Africans traded slaves for, I believe it was, they taught us whiskey, may have been other things, but they taught us whiskey when I was a kid. What people don't realize is that it was the Africans who were kidnapping their fellow Africans and trading them to export to other countries. And this didn't start with the United States. This is the history of Africa. Africa has a history of slavery, and it's the only country that has a continent-wide history of slavery. That is what Africa is. The other continents had slavery, but nowhere near the way Africa did it. It was a way of life preceding the United States and the New World, and trade with the Europeans. Most African slaves went to Arab countries, perhaps Saudi Arabia, Egypt, I don't know. In the modern world, Africans from lower Africa go to northern Africa like Libya to get jobs. When there was a civil war in Libya, there were large numbers of lower African men who were trapped and they didn't know what to do with them. And they were like, I was here, I had a job, and now I'm stuck. And everyone thought they were hired mercenaries, and they said, I'm not a mercenary, I'm just here to work. I got a job. That happens. That's the relationship between North and South Africa. So most Africans, I don't know what the total number was. People estimate 20 million, 30 million. Africans exported slavery to neighboring countries. And it's the history of Africa. The other nations, the European continent, Asia, etc., they were the customers. And I read, may have been on Wikipedia, that there was an emperor in Africa who had organized mass enslavement of Africans and for export, for trade, for his profit. That was their business. So we know that there were people who couldn't afford to go to the United States. Most people, I'm pretty sure that the stats are that most people that came to the United States were either a slave or an indentured servant, which means that they had to live like a slave until a contract ran out, which could have been like 10 years. It's like 70% of the people that came to the New World, something like some crazy number. So slavery, the first slave owner, I'm pretty sure is documented to have been a black man in the United States. And not all black people were slaves in the United States. There were a portion of them, a large portion were, but there were black people that did own land and owned slaves. And the first documented slave owner in the United States, I'm pretty sure, was a black man. You can research it on the internet. Now, the other issue is, if you research African culture, Africans have a slave mentality whereby they believe that one person in the family is the slave of the family, and they pick a person who we might call the black sheep, and that person for the rest of their life and their childhood serves the rest of the family. This is African belief. They have beliefs of slavery. When the United States was formed and slavery became an issue, this was the beginning of the end for slavery, and there were new nations being formed that had slavery. It lasted mostly for short periods of time, and the slavery ended in those countries. However, in Africa, Africa was the last place for slavery to end, and I believe it was the 1950s. The United States was 1850s, and in some places, many places it was before that, because the United States was not the first country to end slavery. But in Africa, the last place to end slavery, 1950s, because they have slave beliefs there. It's been a part of their economy for many years. Traditionally, going back through time, through recorded history, you're going to find that Africa has a history of exporting slaves and beliefs of having a slave as a person in the family. And these are things you can go read about. Go on Wikipedia and read all you want. And when people say, oh, you know, I have hatred for the United States because of slavery, they're really they're listening to a little bit of fake news. They say things like, oh, it's been here for 4 years. Everybody didn't believe in slavery. The North did not believe in slavery. People in the South, there were states where there were more slaves than non-slaves. I believe South Carolina was one of them. And, well, you know, if you've got one family of whites and 200 slaves and they were unhappy, why didn't they kill the slave owner? Well, they were so oppressed that they could not do that because of the threat of being killed. Come on. Like, if there's more slaves in the state, do you really think they couldn't get away? And there were slave revolts, so they obviously did believe that they could revolt, because it did happen. And there was the Underground Railroad, so there was a belief that you could run away. But there were many people that didn't. In fact, when slavery ended, if they didn't like it, why did so many stay on the farms that they had been living on with the same master that they had perhaps since they were born or came to the country? They stayed. And of the ones that became independent, they became sharecroppers. Within 5 or 10 years, 20% of them died of starvation and malnutrition. That's what happened, because they were unable to take care of themselves. They were being taken care of during the time of slavery. And I'm not advocating that slavery is right. I'm just telling you that these are facts that you cannot deny. The belief that every plantation owner abused slaves every day and was threatening them, pointing guns at them and beating them and whipping them is absolute nonsense. My father used to watch, when he was alive, movies on TBS or Turner, one of those Turner Classic. And these were Wild West movies and movies from like the 1930s. They were really old movies. And there were always black people in the movies. And in general, the vast majority of these people were treated with respect. They were just people walking around through the town. They were sheriffs. They worked for law enforcement. They perhaps were an employee working in a store. They had, in general, the portrayal was that these people were treated well. That is the belief of a filmmaker in the 1930s in this country, whereby slaves were still alive. People who had lived in slavery were still alive during this time period. After the end of slavery, there were many blacks who became sheriffs of towns and mayors of towns and things like that. Throughout our history, it's I'm sorry, going back to the 1850s, it did happen in this country. They were respected people. There wasn't such thing that nobody respected black people and they were treated like garbage everywhere they went. It's not true. There are some people who have those beliefs, but I don't believe that it was the general belief of the population of everybody in the United States or everybody in the South. And to hate white people is absolute nonsense. Why don't you hate the people who came up with the idea to export you to Arab countries, to export you to Jamaica, to export you to Brazil, to export you, to kidnap you, perhaps kill people that were your ancestors? Why don't you hate them? They're your own people that did that. Coming to the United States, I'm willing to bet you that there were many people in Africa that knew about the New World, because that's the type of thing where word's going to spread. They're going to know that the New World exists, and they're going to know that it's a good place. And I'm willing to bet you that there were a lot of people who lived in Africa that if you went up to them and said, would you like to go to the New World, they would have said yes. There are so many people today that pay thousands of dollars to be smuggled into the United States. People wanted to be in the United States now, and they wanted to be in the United States then. The United States is a great country. I have lived in 4 or 5 different countries for extended periods of time, more than a year, 10 years. And I've traveled all over the world. I've been to like 30 different countries. And there's one country that I would pick as the perfect country to live in, and that's the United States. These other countries do not live up to the United States. They do not. I met a guy who said he worked in Africa, and he's been all over Africa. I said, well, what's the best part of Africa? You know what his answer was? He said, nothing. He said, there's no best part of Africa. He was a British guy, and he was really old. He was probably in his 60s. So I don't buy the BS when people are angry at the United States and Independence Day and the American flag and founded on race. You're wrong. It's absolutely not true. Not everybody was a plantation owner. Not everybody owned slaves. Not everybody is a descendant. I'm not. I'm first generation American. From Italy, Italians did not enslave anybody except for people who voluntarily became gladiators or whatever. It's just nonsense. These things that people say are based on a lack of education. They're based on ignorance. They're based on fake news. In the 1970s, there was a movie that came out called Roots with Kunta Kinte, where they showed violence against Kunta Kinte. That's the only thing I remember about the movie was him being whipped, and that's it. If there was a part in the movie where the master was nice to him, I don't remember it. These movies are fiction. They're not truth. There's Song of the South, I believe, is a slave movie, I believe, where they show the lifestyle of I guess they were slaves. I really don't remember. And they are not portrayed as people living miserable lives. They're portrayed as happy people. I do not believe that that slaves had such a horrible... I do not believe that they have the horrible life that a modern person believes that they have. And I don't believe that people should be made to feel guilty about something that their ancestors didn't even do. The vast majority of Americans have absolutely no ties to slavery, whether you're Hispanic or white or anything else. I don't have any of my family in the South, etc. Okay, so there's a lot more that I could say about this. If you want to know the truth, look at sources such as Wikipedia. Most of the information, they give sources, newspaper prints, media sources, photographs, testimony from letters that people wrote, etc. Read it and make your own decision. Don't read the news media. Don't read news articles or watch opinions from people that don't know what they're talking about. Don't listen to some guy on the street who has no idea what really happened. These things are just not true.